growing up in Long Island, how does that lead you to 20th Century Fox, where you were for more than a dozen years before you landed at Universal?
Sure. Thank you for that introduction.
You're welcome.
Thank you for having me. Nice to see everybody. I'm from Long Island, New York, and I was like an artsy kid growing up in a very kind of unartsy place, right? So I went to like summer camps and played in bands and just kind of like learned how to play things and just was passionate about music and loved putting on shows and theater and film and all of that. And so I went to Northwestern, where I ended up being a theater major, and then followed a friend out to LA, and I didn't really know anything about anything. I didn't have any family, and I'm not a Nepo kid. I didn't know how the industry worked. We didn't have these devices in our pockets that like answer every question you could possibly ever ask. And so I think what was cool back then is we were allowed to be a little bit dumber than the threshold of what's acceptable today. I just ended up becoming a production assistant on a film. And that really, in addition to everything I learned.
What was the
school,
film?
The movie was a movie called Father of the Bride with Steve Martin and Diane Keaton and Martin Short. And the people who hired me were the then partners Nancy Myers and Charles Shire. So Charles really hired me. Charles just passed away, and I just went to his memorial a few days ago. And so there's a huge loss for the industry. He was an amazing person. I working on that movie was really like my grad school, right? It was like my boot camp. You know, aside from like learning what a production assistant does, which is a lot of stuff, just being on the set when they were filming and being in the cutting room and watching legendary editor Richie Marks edit the film and what a music editor does, and then being in just all the aspects of post-production, learning how specialized all these disciplines are. And I really had like an aha moment when the music for the film was being made. And we went to a scoring stage, which is now the Eastwood stage on the Warner Brothers lot, which was the first time I'd been in front of an orchestra in a studio, and it was just like a spiritual out-of-body experience for me, because I was like, these are my people, this is my thing, this is how my brain is wired. It was like being dropped on an island where there's this language spoken that you didn't even know you were fluent in, and all of a sudden, like, you just understand it, right? And I was like, of all the cool things that I was fortunate to have access to and be a part of, I was like, I just need to be around this as much as possible, all the time. And I learned that there are ways to do that. There are jobs that people have where, like, even in that room, it was so specialized, right? You have a composer and orchestrators and musicians and copyists and tech personnel and engineers, music editors. And so, every one of those things is a very particular path. But then I also learned there's like music supervisors and people on the business side and business affairs, lawyers and creative people and technical, executives. And so that just was the spark that kind of lit the fuse lit the whatever. And then I finished school. I was actually still in school. I finished school and I came back out here, and Charles Shire and Nancy Myers were very nice about holding my place for me, letting me get my undergrad degree. And I came back out here and I just continued working from them, knowing that I had to get to music. So I just worked for them for a couple of years, and through them I met this wonderful songwriter and performer and producer and music supervisor named Steve Tyrell. I worked for Steve for a couple of years, and then I had a neighbor who was working on a TV show, and I worked on this TV show for a couple of years. And then I just had this opportunity to meet with the head of music, a guy named Robert Kraft at 20th Century Fox, almost 30-something years ago. And after many meetings and everything, I got a job. I bullshitted my way into a job. I took all of that stuff. I worked on a movie. I worked in a recording studio for Steve Tyrell. I worked for these filmmakers. I just hustled enough to convince Robert that I would be some sort of like value add to his team and that he should hire me. And that's how I got my job. And then here I am 30 years later.
Well, and obviously one of the biggest pictures you worked on at Fox was Titanic.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about My Heart Will Go On? Did y'all have any idea, and can you ever know that a song from a movie is going to become a worldwide phenomenon like that?
I mean, that's a whole, how much time do we have?
30 minutes.
I got to work with James Horner, you know,
Who was the composer.
Another huge loss for the industry. And my tenure at Fox is kind of bookended by Titanic and Avatar. And I'm very, very fortunate to have worked with James and his team. And the Avatar torch has been passed from James to Simon Franklin, who's also amazing. But on Titanic, it was just a very high pressure situation. You could go pull up old articles about, you know, that was a kind of a production joint venture between Paramount and Fox, and the budget went kind of off the rails, and who had which distribution rights and whose contribution to the budget was capped at what amount. And it became a very high stress situation by the time it got to the point where James needed to show up and score the movie. So really my kind of small role in the whole thing was just to help make the score happen and try to keep it on schedule and on budget, which was very, very challenging considering all the things, you know, James Cameron being this, you know, larger than life force of filmmaking that he is. And it's interesting on a James Cameron film because he can do everything, right? Like he'll take the camera from the cinematographer and say, I'll shoot this. And he'll push the editor out of the way and say, let me sit at the Avid, I'll edit this. The one thing he can't do is music. And so makes for a very James was like, it was just a very challenging dynamic. So you could just feel the air was always thick with the pressure of, we have to do this. And what I remember about the song is that the score for the movie came first, and everybody who knows Titanic, that score is so melodic and tuneful. At some point, James Horner, to his credit, said, we should really turn this into a song. There should be a song that comes at the end of the movie, which is obviously a model. We still kind of will shorthand it as like the Titanic model. And I'm sure it wasn't the first time, obviously, with decades and decades of amazing films before it, but there's something kind of really satisfying about sitting through a movie and kind of absorbing the score and learning the tune subconsciously as part of the movie experience. And then at the end of the movie, you have this like period at the end of the sentence, right? You have a song that kind of fully realizes the potential of the theme in a very satisfying way. And James Horner was just convinced that this was what Titanic needed, and James Cameron just said, absolutely not. I don't want a song. I don't want to put a song at the end of the movie. There's no artist that I want. It kind of became this thing between James Horner and James Cameron, to the point where James Horner, kind of without permission and without telling really anyone, including the studio, he went and got together with Will Jennings, the lyricist. They turned it into a song, and they amazingly got Celine Dion to sing it. So like the demo of the song was probably pretty close to the song that ended up being the song. And then, you know, and sometimes you have to do this. It's a forgiveness versus permission thing, right? It's just a life lesson, like not always. And you can be a rule breaker to a certain extent, and you can do the forgiveness versus permission thing to a certain extent. But to James's credit, he had a vision for this thing, and you know, he ultimately, obviously, convinced James Cameron that this was the way to end the movie. And then we all know what happened from there.
I've never heard that story.
Well, there you go. All right, I guess we're done here.
I've heard that story, but wow, I've never heard that story. How do you work with a composer, and how do you choose a composer for a project? Is it you and the director, or how is that decision made?
Sure, it's a good question, and there is not a good answer to it. I am fortunate. The reason I love my job is that coming at it from the studio side, as opposed to being an independent music supervisor, I give a lot of credit to, and independent supervisors are amazing. But from where I sit, I get to work at a company that has a diverse portfolio of movies of all shapes and sizes, all budget levels, all genres, I like that. I like that I get to just at any given time, I'm working on an animated project, a live action project, a specialty film, a tentpole project, mid-level original movie type productions. and they're all different, right? And so I have this amazing team, and we are a full-service music supervision resource for the whole company, for all of our filmmakers and our partners. And not only are the requirements, we just start with like, what does this movie need? That's a good place to start, which you can start as early as possible. Read the script and you can kind of start to formulate a thought and an opinion about who would be good to score this movie. Like, what is the vision? What are we trying to put up on screen? And it's not just my opinion. It's the filmmaker, it's the studio. We're all kind of signing up for what is hopefully a well-crafted, well-communicated, shared vision of how that script is going to end up as a final product up on the screen. And it can go a lot of different ways. My opinion could sometimes matter and sometimes not. So you have everything from a director who could show up and say, oh, when I make movies, this is how I work, and so is my guy, and just get me my guy and make the deal, and let's, and we're off and running. And sometimes that's how it goes. And then you could have sometimes that same guy or woman could say, I have my guy, I don't want my guy this time. Or I have my guy, they're not available, or they're not affordable, or whatever reason. We know who we want, but we can't have that person. What should we do? Who's like that? Who would if I like working with that person, who else would I like working with? And then sometimes you just go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is a director who might say, this doesn't happen that much, but sometimes they'll say, I have no idea who's on the scene, who would be right for this project, who I would enjoy working with, and then we get to roll up our sleeves and make some recommendations. And within certain parameters, not just like every composer that we've ever wanted to work with, but who's right for this project, who would be a good just person on a personal chemistry level. If we're playing matchmaker, who do we want to put in a room together? Like just on the basis of hopefully they'll like each other and like wanting to work together.
Is there an arranged marriage that you're particularly proud of in that
Yes,
regard?
a few, I think. When I was at Fox years ago, I really had to fight hard to convince the filmmakers, which was studio execs, producers, the director of a movie called The Devil Wears Prada, that there was this guy, Teddy Shapiro, who I thought was amazing. And I just had like a really strong gut feeling that Teddy should do the movie. And there were just a lot of challenges there. Teddy at that time we had just done Dodgeball, a very different kind of movie than Devil Wears Prada, but he had also done, for a different studio, he'd done 13 Going on 30, and that's a beautiful score. And I don't remember what else Teddy had done at the time, but I just knew David Frankel, the director, and Teddy, I knew Teddy would have I just knew how, he would know how to crack the code and give the music for that movie kind of the personality, the style, the panache, all of that stuff that it needed. And I really was assertive. And you have to know when to choose your battles. When are you going to die on this hill? When are you going to fall on your sword? And if you always think you're going to die on the hill and fall on your sword, you're going to lose your credibility, right? So if you choose those battles, which at that time, that was one that I really believed in. So I really pushed, and I didn't get it all the way there. I think we got to the point where the compromise was Teddy can audition, right? Teddy can read the script and talk to David and write some music and submit some cues that would give an indication of how he would approach the material. And what I remember really distinctly is that we got a CD from Teddy, which was state of the art, and it had some cues on it that were so good, and that those melodies and themes that he came up with as like his demo, his spec audition for the movie, those themes kind of note for note became the themes of Devil Wears Prada. And so looking back, like I am especially proud of that one. And then if I fast forward to just now, I think the other one, it's like that. Although there wasn't as much resistance. It's just more of like an unknown kind of gamble to these filmmakers. Was an animated film we did called Wild Robot with Chris Bowers, who's amazing, and was just nominated for an Oscar for that score. So those moments, those are real kind of, you get to be proud of those, because you sort of, part of my job is to be strong in my convictions. My opinion may not matter in a lot of situations, you know. In my opinion, and $5 will get you a latte at Starbucks, right? So but sometimes someone will want to listen maybe to what I have to say, and when it goes that way, you know, a long time, 20 whatever years ago, Devil Wears Prada, to not that long ago with Chris Bowers on Wild Robot, like that's pretty cool. That's really satisfying.
Talk about your role when you're doing an actual musical. So let's look at Wicked, where how many years have you worked on Wicked? And obviously the songs, in this case, the songs were already finished for part one, but you know, the songs have to be done because they're performed in the movie. You're not dropping in songs later. So talk about the difference between working on a musical, and if you've got any good Wicked examples, versus working on something where you're just needle dropping in music later.
I mean, you just kind of identified a lot of like the difference between a musical and a movie with needle drops. You know,
when did you start working on Wicked? How many years ago?
So I found a text that I sent to Mark Platt about Ariana Grande, who had made it her life's mission to, so I can take no credit for anything, but we were making a movie called Sing a number of years ago. In 2016, we were finishing this movie, and we were really fortunate that we had Ryan Tedder doing an original song with Stevie Wonder and Ariana Grande. We were in the studio recording it. Somehow Wicked came up, so this is 2016, and Ariana, I think, mentioned Wicked, and I was like, oh, do you want me to send a text to Mark Platt, and I can just continue to cheerlead for, and so I found that text from 2016 where I told Mark Platt, like, nobody could do this thing like Ariana can. But then more meaningfully than that, I found an email, I think from 2017, where we were talking about composers, and I was saying to Mark Platt, you know, like, it's a really complicated thing, the stage to screen thing, and there's this hugely wonderful, celebrated body of work from a musical that doesn't necessarily need more, you know, music making. Oh, it does. It needs a different kind of music making to put it on the screen. But we were talking about bringing in a composer who wasn't an obvious musical theater Broadway type person, and I started talking about John Powell, which was another Teddy Shapiro, Chris Bowers type thing for me. It's like, I really believe John Powell would somehow just know how to crack the code on scoring Wicked in a cinematic way and bringing things that the stage play didn't have to the equation. And so that's when I'd say in earnest we really started kind of laying the groundwork for what became Wicked as a production. But I think in earnest, once it was like greenlit and budgeted and we were off and running and really rolling up our sleeves and getting into it, started 3 years ago.
That's still a pretty long time.
It's a long time.
Since we do have a global audience here, I want to ask you, when you're thinking about music for a movie or for a soundtrack, how much are you thinking about an international audience?
Yeah, we're a global company too. Our movies, you know, perform, hopefully and thankfully, at the international box office. We have an amazing domestic team and we have an amazing international team with MDs and distributors, you know, all over the world. So we do try to think globally. You know, you could kind of tie yourself up in knots if you're trying to make something that's all things to all people in all parts of the world. I don't know if that exists. So sometimes you just have to sort of like make the best version of the thing that you're making and hope that it translates. And interestingly, if you spend time studying the charts of like what's top of the charts in Europe and in Western Europe or Eastern Europe or in Asia, on a commercial level, it's a lot of the same stuff. Artists that are big here at home are also big around the world, and there's value there. And then you get in, you can start parsing the differences in different places. But you know, I'd say a good recent example of your question is a movie like Twisters, right? Like Twisters is, you know, from a domestic standpoint, a movie that you go, well, that feels like a very American movie. Doesn't mean that audiences around the world won't be interested in it, but to make Twisters the way that Lee Isaac Chung and the collective of people making the movie were envisioning it, it was a very authentic, organic, like very Oklahoma. It had to feel not just like it's American, but it was like Oklahoma in a very real, organic and authentic and genuine way. And it really, you know, so it wasn't, I think the movie from a long time ago was a little bit more of like the slicker Hollywood kind of, it was a little bit goofier, a little more tongue-in-cheek. There was more of a wink I think, to that Twisters, although that Twisters was amazing. This one was very much like, you know, tornado storm chasers today. What we learned, it was a few things. Like we made a commitment early on that we were going to really lean into that and make a country music soundtrack, which hasn't been a thing in a long time, and it's not a thing that often. And you would think with movies of all shapes and sizes that we get to play in all different sandboxes. And I think at best, we have dabbled in country music, but we haven't really gotten to roll up our sleeves and be like all in on like, we're gonna make a country, end-to-end country soundtrack with like the most relevant, coolest artist of the moment that means something that would work for the picture. And that's what that became, which was great. Whether or not that travels across the ocean in every direction, that was interesting. And I mean, what we learned, I think, just as a movie studio, is there's a lot of parts of the world where people don't even know what tornadoes are, you know, let alone whether or not they listen to, Luke Combs and Lainey Wilson and Miranda and Miranda Lambert and all the artists that, we were fortunate to have on the soundtrack. So, Universal distributed that movie domestically. We had a partnership with Warner Brothers who marketed and distributed the movie outside the US. And I think there were a lot of lessons learned about the difference between how that movie and soundtrack performed domestically versus outside the States. And so that's going to be very different than like Despicable Me, which in a decade and a half has become a record-breaking like $5 billion franchise. And that we have learned travels to every, you don't have the Minions doing Minionese, gibberish, whatever, like people seem to love that everywhere, and the music that goes with it that Pharrell makes and all of that.
That translates.
Yeah.
Let's talk about